Greetings and various assorted salutations. Welcome to another government lecture. Today we're looking at various assorted forms of government. This is kind of looking at different technical definitions for various aspects of governments and kind of how they function. Not all governments are created equal, and who holds power determines everything from your paycheck to freedom of speech. That's the short way of putting things, I guess. For our learning objectives, we've got a few here, 3 in total. We're going to compare different forms of political and economic distribution, power distribution. We're going to explain the advantages and disadvantages of some major government systems. We're going to evaluate the balance of authority and individual rights as well. So those are the 3 things we're going to be focusing on. Now, there's a few terms and definitions we need to go over. Let's get right into them. First up is monarchy. This is rule by one, such as a king or a queen. I suppose you could also consider an emperor in a similar manner, a similar strain, but they are usually hereditary. That means a family rules it and is passed down through the family, down through the ages and generations. Probably the things you're thinking of are the medieval ages, or perhaps the kings and queens of the ancient civilizations. But I believe Thailand would be another modern example. Next up is dictatorship. Dictatorship is rule by one leader with absolute control. It's usually taken over by force. A lot of dictatorships that we're used to hearing about in the 20th century were a military officer takes over the government and runs the government in place of whatever was there before. Often we think of military generals who, using their military connections, take over and rule. Oligarchy is the rule by a small group of elites. If we're looking at a historical example of oligarchy, the Republic of Venice is an excellent example. Essentially, Venice was ruled by wealthy merchants. These wealthy merchants appointed the Doge and the various leadership positions and ran the Republic of Venice as basically an extension of their companies. That's oversimplified, but it'll do. Democracy, is a term you hear thrown around a lot, is the rule by the people, either directly or through elected representatives. Basically, the idea in a democracy is you have people who can make decisions, they vote on decisions, and typically the most popular group, the largest group to vote in one way or the other, is how the decision is made. Republic is a representative democracy where leaders are elected and those leaders run the country, representing the will of the people. Republics are going to be running with elected officials. You're thinking senators, representatives, mayors, presidents. Those are the kind of positions you might hear in a republic. We have a presidential system, which is a system where you have an executive and a legislative branch are separate. And we'll get more into executive and legislative branches differently. But essentially, an executive branch is kind of a leadership branch, and then the legislative branch is usually part of government that makes laws and comes up with rules. That's really oversimplified, but moving on. Parliamentary systems are also quite common. Quite a few of them are found in Europe, and those are systems where the executive is dependent on the legislature. So in like a presidential system, you might elect a president, and then you'd elect representatives to go to the legislative branch. In a parliamentary system, you elect representatives for the legislative branch, and then within that legislature branch, they choose one of their members to become an executive, to be kind of the head figure, the head person. But another way of talking about governments and how they're organized is with the unitary system versus a federal system. When you're talking about a unitary system, we're talking about power centralized in one national government. There's kind of the central government that runs the show. Whereas a federal system, the next term, is power shared between national and state governments. These responsibilities and powers of government are divided up. A confederal system or a confederacy is a loose alliance of states, and the central government is weaker. So usually in a federal system, you may have a state and a federal government, a state and a central government. The central government's more powerful. In a confederal system or confederacy, you have a bunch of states, and they have more power than the central government. Probably the example that many Americans would think of as the Confederate States of America, though other confederacies that are quite arguably more successful would include the Iroquois Confederacy and Switzerland for practical, more realistic examples of success. Now we need to look at in political power, who rules? We talked about power and authority, power the other day. And power and authority is often held and expressed and determined in a very specific way when you're talking about how a government is run. And there's different types of government and different ways that this power process is sorted through. Do recall that power is the ability to control or influence the behavior of people. Usually we're thinking through laws and authority. Authority is a word that's come up a lot, so I better define it for y'all. And that is, authority is the recognized right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. Authority is, we're listening to you. We're doing what you ask. We're doing what you say. That's what authority amounts to, is when people obey authority. So authority and power are two related concepts. Power is the power to influence and control. Authority is the recognizing of power. Perhaps this painting is an excellent example. This is the coronation of Napoleon Bonaparte I. But what happens is Napoleon's authority stems from his own power and authority. He takes the crown and crowns himself Emperor of France, the Empire of France. Napoleon's power and the reason why people listen to him is using the military. He seized control of the government, and through the military and government officials that he appointed and gave power to, they were able to enforce things like the Napoleonic Code and whatnot. These are topics really covered in more detail in other classes, but let's move on to the types of authority that we see practiced. One of these is autocracy. This is the power held in the hands of one. This is the power of monarchs. This is the power of dictators. That's where the power comes from, autocracy. Oligarchy is the rule of the few. Typically, you see oligarchies in a rule of an elite class of people. This elite class may stem from the military. This may stem from nobles. This may stem from political party elites. This may stem from business leaders. It really depends on what else is going on in this country. But it's the rule of a small group of very powerful people. And then the third type we observe is democracy, which is rule by the many, where we see there is a way to participate in government, and that way to participate is open to a lot of people, usually under the terms of something along the lines of citizenship. Now, one of the things that's kind of come up is I've said democracy and I've said republic, and they sound a lot alike, and some of the definitions are a bit confusing. Democracy is rule by the people, and republic is representative government. Well, which is it? The United States is what you would call a democratic republic. To make this more confusing, democracy and republic are often words used interchangeably back as far as like the Founding Fathers' time. So when you're reading a lot of documents from the Founding Fathers, they don't separate the difference between republic and democracy. They do have different definitions, as we saw, but it's just not as important unless you're getting into the philosophical debates over it. Many people, if you really wanted to get in the woods of the definition, democracy is where you vote directly on the issues, whereas a republic is where you vote for somebody and that somebody represents you on the issues. Republics are generally, I mean, if we want to be really technical, republics are more common because the act of governing, running a country or being in government is often at the very least a part-time job, and in upper levels of government, a full-time job. And so as a result, many democracies are really republics because we have somebody, a representative, whether it's a senator or a president or something, that we choose, and they represent our interests in making government decisions. But it's a technicality, whatever. But really what's probably more important to our interests is how much power does the people have? Is it consolidated into a group like an oligarchy? Is it consolidated into one, or is it a democracy? That's probably where you'd be more interested, and the literature is more focused on rather than the technicalities of two words. The next subject we look at is economic power. Who owns what? Now, we're vastly oversimplifying a lot of economic stuff here. Government and economics are intertwined. They are separate entities, but they are also connected entities. One can influence the other quite a bit. But first, economics. What is economics? It's the study of how people and societies use their limited resources to meet their needs and wants. That's what economics is. You might be thinking of it of buying and selling goods, trading for resources. That's economics. And economics is all about decisions. I have $5. Do I buy this? Do I buy that? Or maybe I just save that money and use it for something else later. That's economics. Now, there's several major types of economies out there. There is the capitalist economy. You probably learned about this in U.S. history classes, probably U.S. history 2 if you're in our system. And that is where most of the things being produced are owned by private individuals or companies that are managed by private individuals. And so most of the wealth, most of the economy is run by the decisions of people. In a socialist system, you are seeing a mix of things. There are some private businesses. There's a number of private decisions being made, but the government may run some key industries or run certain businesses for the benefit of the people. This gets back into the functions of government that we looked at in the first lecture. Sometimes some of the services a government provides help turn the government into more of a mixed economy, as another way of putting it. On the other end of the spectrum, so if you're like looking at this across a board, communism or the command economy is where the government basically owns everything. They own the factories, they own the companies, and really the citizens are viewed as using these resources, not owning these resources directly like you would in a capitalist society. Now, to be brutally honest, these definitions, while they're nice and clean, the real world's much messier. Most governments are a mix. The United States has a lot of capitalism, but we also have programs like Social Security. We have government regulation on private business. And so we are somewhere between capitalism, market economy, and the mixed economy. Likewise, like if you look at China, the government does control a lot of industries, but not everything. So they're more leaning towards something between communism and socialism with a lot of capitalism. And so, I mean, these definitions are nice, but they're more intellectual debate than pure things you can find just one country doing one of them. Next up, we got to go into shared systems of power. Government is complicated. At the lower levels of government, it might be a part-time job, but many government officials are doing their job full-time. And this is because there's a lot going on, there's a lot to do. And so to simplify things or divide out the work, most governments are divided up and they function at different levels. At the highest level, you have international organizations like the UN, you have treaty alliances like NATO, and there's an international level of government. This is where diplomacy, trade negotiations, war and peace occurs at the international level. When we go down to the national level, we're talking about within a country's borders. The authority within a country's borders. So like the US government located in Washington, D.C., they make policies and rules and laws that impact the entire United States, from the Aleutian Islands in Alaska down to the islands of Key West and Puerto Rico. They make the rules and the laws for all of these places. And then the government you probably interact with a lot more than you realize is the local government. Local governments can be the state government. They can be the county government, where a state is divided up into parts. It can be city government as well. That's what local government looks like. And they handle matters immediate to the local area, such as maintaining public infrastructure for a city, or handling the education rules for a state, to name a few. Now, when it comes to how these governments interact with their different levels, like who has more power, who decides what, we have several different breakups for that. You have the unitary, where the central government is supreme. Good examples of this are the United Kingdom and Japan. They do have local governments, but the central government, whether it's located in London or Tokyo, they hold the most authority and their rule comes first. More familiar to us in America are the federal government system, where nation and state have a great deal of powers divided between them. There are some things that the states handle. There are some things that the nation handles. There are some things that the nation can overrule, and there's some things that the states can overrule. It gets complicated, it gets messy real quick. The United States, India, and I believe Mexico would be excellent examples of the federal system. We've mentioned confederacies before, and this is where the states or the parts of the country have most of the power and the central government is quite weak. Probably the best modern day example is the European Union. The European Union is a multi-nation government organization. However, most of the matters handled in the European Union are handled at a lower level. Like when you're in Germany, you're working with the German state. When you're in Italy, you're working with the Italian state. When you're in France, you're in the French state. Places like that. The United States of America does have a historical example of this. Around the Revolutionary period in the early days of the United States of America, when we worked under the Articles of Confederacy, we were a confederacy. Also, if you're remembering your U.S. history classes, the Confederate States of America would be another example of that. The states held most of the power, and the central government handled a few things like post office and trying to win the Civil War. If we're looking for another in the Americas example, the Iroquois Confederacy is probably one of the best ones. They were 5 or 6 different tribes, depending on which year you're asking. And each of the tribes kind of handled their own business. But when they had to coordinate things, they came together and they negotiated in a confederacy. So for the most part, they handled each tribe handled their own business. But when they needed to come together and make a decision or deal with something, that's when the central part of the Iroquois Confederacy came together. There's also another divide between presidential and parliamentary systems. Presidential systems, like the United States of America, and let's be honest, this is U.S. government, so we're going to focus more on them to begin with. There's a separation of power and responsibilities amongst the different parts of government, which we'll talk about a lot more later. Our neighbors across the pond or up north in Canada or the United Kingdom, respectively, I mixed up my geography. The United Kingdom and Canada are parliamentary systems, and that's a very different government setup. Instead of fixed political terms, they have elections at a different rate, and that's something that when we get into more comparative government stuff later in the course, we'll talk about that in more detail. We mainly focus on presidential and federal stuff because that's what America is. Let's ignore some technicalities. To be brutally honest, most of this lecture has been in technical terms. These terms are great for debate in political theory. They're great for debate in editorials. They're great for talking about and trying to simplify things into models. However, you have to remember all the terms we just went over are models. There's very few pure examples of a federal system. There's very few pure examples of this, that, and the other thing. And the other problem we run into is a lot of these concepts some of them are more historical. There's a lot of things that have happened over the centuries. Like when we talk a lot about dictatorships, dictators of the ancient world are very different from modern day dictators in many regards. And history, culture, all these things filter through and make things different at different times and different places. It matters because these terms allow us to talk about power and how it's distributed. How do the people within a country have their interests represented? Are they appealing to a monarch? Are they voting in elections? Who decides what and when and where is a very important topic of dispute and comes up time and time again when we're talking about government. Now, it's worth noting we need to take a moment and talk about what is the United States of America. If we're using the terms that we got up there and a few more that I might have forgotten to mention that we'll talk about later, the United States government is a constitutional, federal, democratic republic with a presidential system and is a mixed capitalist economy. It's a government that, if you read our founding documents, was designed to balance power between the people, the states, and the national government. It's a delicate balancing act, and it's pretty amusing to watch sometimes. If we break down these definitions, let's break it down. Democratic Republic. If you're an American citizen, you have the right to vote in elections, and the people you elect to office will represent your interests in government. They vote on laws, they meet in a capital, whether it's the state or the nation's capital or the county seat, and they make the rules at the level that they're at. They represent your interests. If you don't like what they say, you elect somebody else in the next election. It's a federal system. The national and the state governments, 50 of them at the time of this recording, they have different roles and responsibilities. The state of South Dakota's government is responsible for the state of South Dakota. The government in Washington, D.C. is the government over all the states and handles disputes between the states and other matters, to name a few. America is a presidential system. Basically, every 4 years, we have a presidential election. This is a separate election from Congress, where we elect representatives. The president represents one part of our government, and Congress represents another part of government that makes laws. We'll talk about this more in the coming units. It's an economy that is based on capitalism. Despite that, it is mixed. There's a lot of private ownership. Many big businesses are based out of America. You've heard of many of them. A lot of things are privately held in the United States. However, there's a number of public-owned businesses run by the government. There is things like education and defense. Those are managed by the United States government. Additionally, there's things like Social Security. There's government regulation on how things like the stock market run. And as a result, it's a mixed economy. Mostly capitalist. It leans more that direction, but it's more mixed than a lot of people want to simplify. Constitutional, this is a topic for a future lecture, but the United States of America derives its authority from the U.S. Constitution. This Constitution limits what government can and can't do. It outlines individual rights, with the parts that's been added to it. I'll talk more about that later. But if you want to think of it this way, the United States draws its authority from an instruction manual written a while back. But the full details of that is a topic for another day. I've filled you with enough technical terms for now. Let's stop there. I guess, until later.